So I found out recently that real school social workers contracts haven't been renewed. Yeah, there was an article quoting, I think it was Tutor talking about it. I just have one question to the Minister of Education. What am Alright, let's talk about trade unions. Firstly, what is a trade union? Trade union defines organizations that emerged in the early 20th century as a response to colonial exploitation and economic inequality. These organizations sought to empower laborers through collective bargaining, political activism, and social reform. Alright, let's start with some information we most easily have access to online. According to resources online from our own National Library, between 1934 and 1937, workers became more influenced by a need for change resulting in strikes and riots on the sugar plantations and in the oil fields, and in September 1937, the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, the OWTU, also became the first registered trade union in the country representing the rights of those in the petroleum industry. They continue. This social unrest then extended throughout the Caribbean and gave rise to several prominent labor leaders in Trinidad and Tobago, such as Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler, Captain Andrew Arthur Cipriani, George Weeks, Albert Maria Gomez, Adrian Cola Rienzi, Elmer Francois, and CLR James. It's not an understatement to say that these men and women have had some of the greatest impact here on our lives in Trinidad and Tobago. And it's an absolute disgrace that we as a country just let the history fade away. And it's a shame that I don't have more time in this video to talk about them, but let me just give you a snippet of two of these amazing giants. In November 1919, after a labor dispute took place at the Port of Spain Wharf, Cipriani called on the workers to withhold their efforts, resulting in the first large industrial strike of the 20th century. At the time, Cipriani was a member of the Trinidad Working Men's Association, the TWA, which fought for the improvement of workers' rights. Cipriani worked with the TWA for many years, furthering the trade union's commitment to labor activism. He eventually became the organization's president in 1923. Over the years, Cipriani's efforts to seek justice for the ex-soldiers and other disenfranchised groups earned him the nickname Champion of the Barefooted Man. Neither low wages, unemployment, nor a contracting economy aggravated by the global economic depression could persuade the working class to turn against their man. In his usual prophetic manner, Butler summed up his raison d'etre. How do you say that? Raison d'etre. Whatever. After years and years of weeping and groanings, untold miseries and complaining, prayers and petitions, the toiling masses of this colony prayed to the God of justice and fair play, freedom and liberty, the God of their ancient and incomparably glorious African forefathers, to send them a leader. On May 9, 1937, Butler uttered words at an address to oil workers which were regarded as inflammatory and dangerous. He allegedly incited the crowd to riot and acted seditiously, encouraging the multitude to resist colonial authority. He was thus to appear in court on June 17 to answer these charges. Disregarding the court order, Butler chose to honor another engagement, which he was carded to appear 2 days later. The authorities, having gotten wind of the meeting in Faizabad, had planned to apprehend him. A member of the local intelligentsia, or perhaps a daft citizen of the North, underestimated the vexations experienced by oilfield workers, deeming them minor labor troubles reported from South Trinidad. Thus, the meeting scheduled for that fateful day of June 19th was expected to be most uneventful. Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler was one of the few, including the great Elmer Francois, who stridently objected to colonialism, advocating for systemic reform. Thus, placing trust in their chief spokesperson, participants in the demonstration collectively decided that Butler was to be shielded by any means. The strike, however, was no ordinary one. Workers broiled with pent-up frustration owing to low wages and the racial injustice that they faced on the job site. These issues were compounded by the broader context of general discriminatory practices against the poor black masses, censorship of non-white thoughts and opinions, and anti-African legislation that prescribed their worship and forms of cultural expression. Then, there was oppressive legislation that struck hard. In 1935, there was the Slum Clearance Ordinance, which seemed to obfuscate the reality of stark poverty by cleaning up the eastern fringes of Port of Spain. Sounds familiar. Even the cleverest Calypsonian could hardly mask his support of the Grenadian-born Messiah. Most Calypsos that paid tribute to Butler, including Roaring Lions, Butler the Leader, and the riot in Trinidad, were banned. President of the National Workers' Union, Dave Smith, adds some color to our understanding of the history of unions. He hones in on the relationship between trade unions and class and the ways in which unions today continue that struggle. He writes, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." Smith continues, "The development of trade unions has never taken a straight path. The ebbs and flows of the strengths of trade unions reflects the struggle between the interests of labor and those of capital. Let us be under no illusion that what we are talking about here is power. Who has the power and what gives them that power? There are some, particularly amongst the representatives and spokespersons of the employing class, who point to the decline in trade union membership and influence over the past period and are eager to relegate trade unions to the dustbin of history. Those who peddle this view have very little understanding of the nature and dynamic of the class struggle in a capitalist society. The reality is that trade unions are a product of the political and economic environment within which they exist. As an economy changes its structure, so areas where unions have historically been strong decline, and new areas that need to be organized open up. An example of how trade union movement adapts to changes in the economy, even though slowly, can be seen in the growth of the banking, insurance, and general workers' union, who have established solid roots amongst workers in the finance and service sectors. This Newsday article echoes some of Smith's points and turns a critical lens onto unions today. They do this by looking at the apparent... Oh, there's something stuck in my throat. They do this by looking at the apparent decline in union political power, as well as their ability to advocate for workers. Throughout the mid-20th century, unions became instrumental in shaping labor policies and securing benefits such as minimum wage laws, better working conditions, and access to healthcare and education for workers. However, as the political landscape evolved, the influence of unions began to wane. Economic shifts, particularly the transition from agricultural-based economies to more diversified ones, challenged the traditional union model. Increasing competition from globalization and rising unemployment rates have further compounded these challenges. This article is not just critical of unions though. The writer sees unions' roles as evolving but still critical for Trinidad and Tobago today. While trade unions in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean face substantial challenges, the assertion that they are dying may be an oversimplification. Instead, unions are in a period of transformation, grappling with new labor realities and shifting worker dynamics. To remain relevant, trade unions must adapt their strategies, embrace new organizing models, and engage more effectively with younger and non-standard workers. If trade unions can successfully navigate these challenges, they will continue to play a critical role in advocating for workers' rights and social justice in the Caribbean. The future of trade unions relies on their ability to evolve and respond to the contemporary workforce's needs while maintaining their foundational goals of equity, justice, and solidarity. Alright, so we have a story painted for us involving class struggles evolving into a political movement focused on getting better conditions for the working class, which honestly is like 90% of us. But outside of the internet, we in Trinidad and Tobago have different ways of knowing and understanding our history. I'm going to be looking at two of these ways, so I'm going to be speaking with a knowledgeable elder about what they know about trade unions and also going to be looking at Calypsos from the time. Alright, this is a really cool tidbit of history. the first ever Calypso monarch, they called it Calypso king back then, in 1939, was Neville Marcano, the Growling Tiger, and he sang a calypso about trade unions. It was called the West Indian Labour Situation, but it goes by a bunch of different names, including trade union, the labour situation in Trinidad and Tobago, join a union, advice to West Indians. This was only 2 years after the Oilfield Trade Workers Union, the OWTU, had their riots and everything that was happening with the trade unions. That's so cool. Here's an excerpt sung by Growling Tiger himself during an interview with the legendary ALVIN DANIELL.
The community when I sing union song. I'm advising every worker as a West Indian to try and join a labor union. I'm advising every worker as a West Indian, try and join a labor union. It's the only way you can achieve your right and to stop the oppressive hands of might who allow your progressive march to be an inspiration to the rising generation. That is the first part.
Alright, I don't think I need to explain any further other than what Growling Tiger explained himself, but the significance of that being the calypso that won, and so many calypsos in 1939 and onwards focusing on trade unions, is important in itself. If you want some more info on Growling Tiger, this documentary is a great deep dive into his life and also highlights the way that Calypso as a political art form has been instrumental to our people's lives and our country's prosperity. Also in my research, I came across ALVIN DANIELL's YouTube channel where he's uploaded more than 125 videos of his Calypso showcase videos interviewing Calypsonians, pan band leaders and artists from all across the country. This is a super important archival source, so please check it out. Oh yeah, and subscribe and watch his stuff. Also, if anyone has a contact for Mr. ALVIN DANIELL, please put me in contact with him. I just want to talk to him. I also have the great honor of being able to speak to and learn from one of our country's national treasures, Miss N2 Pearl Springer, who, and I'm going to read this as a quote. Miss N2 Pearl Springer, Poet Laureate of Port of Spain from 2002 to 2009, founder of the National Heritage arm of the NALIS, National Library and Information System Authority, playwright for internationally renowned works including the one I've most recently seen on Carnival Friday of this year, Camberley, activist, overall troublemaker in the most amazing way, and someone who I hold very dearly in my heart. So, yeah, I'm beyond honored. I'm so happy to be able to speak with Miss N2 and learn from her because she's amazing. Speaking with Miss N2, she threw out some important names and legislation surrounding unions. She said, Butler, Cipriani, George Weeks, who became head of the first registered trade union, if my memory serves. Also, looking at legislation for workers, Industrial Relations Act, etc. Ms. N2 suggested reading the book For Bread, Power and Justice by Kafra Kambon, which I'll take a read of when I get the chance, because it goes into detail about many of the things that trade unions have done for us in Trinidad and Tobago. On the note of what trade unions have done for us, here are some things that for some reason I couldn't find that Miss N2, along with some of the workers in the National Heritage Library, were able to find about the great, I don't even know what to, the successes of unions that we tend to take for granted here in Trinidad and Tobago, like the 8-hour work week, overtime pay, workers' compensation, and improved working conditions. Recognition of trade unions, of which there are currently 85 plus, and in 1970 there were 130 plus, paving the way for our independence by championing greater self-government and championing reforms, molding and shaping many of our most prominent political leaders, kickstarting the 1970s Black Power Revolution, championing women's rights and equality, the establishment of the industrial courts where all unsettled trade disputes, whether individual or collective, have to end up, and then championing both multiracial and ethnically focused labor-oriented groups focused on raising everyone in the working class up instead of falling into the divide and conquer colonialist mentality that frames a lot of our current day politics as well. On the note of the connections between trade unions and politics though, Ms. Entu went on to speak about how many of the labor union leaders would eventually find their way into politics. Bastio Pandey rose from the Sugar Workers Union to become Prime Minister. George Weeks and Clive Nunes, another labor leader, were very involved in the Black Power movement in the 1970s. While entering the realm of politics has allowed for the trade union movements to have more proximity to power, union leaders shifting into politics has often coincided with a shift from a focus on working class politics to a more cautious middle class reformism and even conservatism. This historical precedent set by leaders like Cipriani and Rienzi continues even today, with unions often aligning themselves with political parties as opposed to engaging adversarially with them. This often leads to them being seen as nothing more than political pawns to be used for elections and then probably discarded by the victorious party. Reminiscing on days when trade union leaders would strike fear into government officials' hearts and be seen as true adversaries of an oppressive state, Ms. Entu says, Weeks, Nunes, Pandey, Butler, of course, have raised their voices in loud defense of justice for workers and the rights of all citizens. Today, the voices of the leaders of the trade union movement are muted and unheard. This sentiment is also echoed in a poem that Miss Entu graciously located for me by Eric Roach, who he honestly deserves his own video because he's such an interesting man. Eric Roach wrote a poem about Butler that was republished in 2012 in 100 Poems from Trinidad and Tobago by Ian Diafantala and Anson Gonzalez. Ballad for Tubal Butler. When I met him face to face, he had become a poor buffoon, a decrepit, toothless hound, whining at his private fleas. Yet proud and raging in his prime, his anger set a blazing torch to centuries rotten with our shames and signed the old slave tapestry. Corporal King died roaring in a bonfire of the seasoned sins. A British officer named Powers was executed by the mob, whose rage and hatred, fear and need, roused to desperate bloody deeds, flayed fat folly to awareness, and thrust politics a theme. Then every liar in the land, village lout and city snip, every rogue turned orator, not one hibiscus blazed unseen. Now the heroic man grown old eats the pap of the mad lair. I've heard him rant and seen him mocked, because history's ceaseless flood has left him on a muddy shoal, sometimes baying at the wind, sometimes howling, a mad dog, at the current in its course. Miss Entu's words echo the ideas expressed in the online articles, newspaper articles, Calypso by Growling Tiger, and poem by Eric Roach. Unions have historically been powerhouses of workers' advocacy, vehicles to fight for the rights of workers and everyday citizens, and fight against the inflated power of money, capital, and the state in Trinidad and Tobago. However, with our country's adoption of party politics, unions have more often than not found themselves viewed as useful political pawns to be used for general elections and then discarded. Adding to that, unions have been slow to keep up with our ever-changing, technologically advancing world, where the powers of capital have found new and interesting ways to erode workers' protections and hoard money for themselves. My script editor, Mark, insisted that I remind you here that this is still all about the aptly named class struggle. It's always ongoing. The moment we forget the importance of the struggle, the cohort of capitalists, that is people with capital, who are putting their needs above ours for fair wages and reasonable accommodations, will start to take advantage. As always, there's a path forward and a road that needs to be walked. So let's get up and walk it. Let's bring back standing up for each other and with each other because, let's be real, 90% of us are the working class we're always referring to, and having real oppositional forces to oppression. Find a way to organize and join your union, or a union and association associated with your profession. And if the leaders of that union aren't doing what you need them to do, find a way to push them to do that, or to push them out. And if you're not a fan of the vehicle of the union, that's okay. Find other ways for you and your colleagues to organize to make things better for all of you there. We as a people have a long historic tradition of always pushing for better. And it's our turn to take up that tradition. And Auntie Cams, listen. If you fix your mouth to say one more stupid thing about Calypso, I'll